So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a Dinosaurus? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur, back again for more Canadian creationist craziness. So grab some Molson beer, a big bowl of beaver and maple syrup with a side of poutine, and let's settle in as we continue to hear about how the flood caused basically all of geology, even though we all know it didn't.
Here's a picture from Grand Canyon. See the very straight line between those two layers? Evolutionists say there's a gap of 10 million years between those layers.
Really?
Then it shouldn't be that straight, right?
Hey look, it's the interface between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale. You know, one bit of rock that had to form in still calm water, and another that formed above water in a sandy desert. But anyway, there's no reason it shouldn't be that straight. At this point in the script writing process, I was getting a bit burned out trying to look up geology sources and whatnot and digging through Portuguese creationist websites and the like to get to German paleontology articles, so I enlisted some help from my friend Corporal Anon. Of course, none of this should be taken on his authority, and the sources are in the description as usual. So this is what he got back to me with. The underlying contact with the Hermit Shale is indeed low relief, maximum of 8 feet in relief. But this is entirely consistent with the conventional history of the region. First, the Hermit Shale is thought to represent a very low-lying tidal flat/coastal plain environment, with some minor marine elements. There is no reason to suppose the period of exposure which followed deposition of the Hermit was accompanied by any sort of dramatic drop in sea level, hundreds of feet or more, which would allow the formation to deeply channelize the surface. In fact, it is generally accepted that the Hermit Shale upper surface was very close to sea level during this period of erosion. Hydrologist Tim Helbel said this to me when I asked him about the low relief contact in question. He, Ariel Roth, assumes that a time gap of a certain amount of years corresponds to X feet of erosion. The amount of erosion would actually depend on what the terrain was like during the time gap period. For example, if it was close to sea level during that time, a comparatively small amount of vertical erosion would have been allowed. Indeed, close to sea level terrain is what is indicated in the depositional environments, all from the other Grand Canyon layers. I had to fact check him, of course, and it turns out he's correct. This is a quotation from the Grand Canyon National Park Geological Resources Inventory Report 2020. Quote, "Except for a geologically brief period in the Devonian, the Grand Canyon region was either submerged or relatively close to sea level throughout the Paleozoic and most of the Mesozoic." End quote. Now, most young Earth creationists may concede that this could explain why hundreds of feet of relief are not found, but still complain we should see at least a few tens of feet of relief and evidence of channel scour. But geologists don't really expect this to necessarily be the case. There are erosional processes which can generate near-planar erosion surfaces. Stratigrapher Andrew Mial listed a few examples in a 2016 stratigraphy book he authored. This is from Mial Andrew D. Stratigraphy, A Modern Synthesis, Springer Verlag, 2016, page 47. Quote, "Erosion surfaces may exhibit little erosional relief, which may belie their importance. In non-marine environments, sheet erosion, wind deflation, and pedimentation can generate virtually planar erosion surfaces." End quote. And geologist Kevin Nelstead also explains why the lack of river incision isn't shocking given the environmental context of the erosional period. Quote, "In an increasingly arid environment, it should not be surprising that there is little in the way of stream channel erosion or soil development beneath the Coconino." Source, 6-bed Arguments from Answers in Genesis by GeoChristian. Of course, even if we give young Earth creationists the benefit of the doubt and assume rivers were the dominant erosional force, rather than chemical weathering and wind planation, still, this does not preclude a planar contact. We know rivers can make very planar surfaces given the right conditions. Strong and Paola, 2008, performed a series of experiments to study the effects of sea level fall on how rivers erode into the underlying layers of a sequence boundary. They found that, given slow falls of sea levels, rivers laterally migrate too fast relative to their gradual incision to ever form valleys. Instead, they create a broad and flat erosion surface. Though these experiments do have some simplifications, such as holding water and sediment supply constant, sufficient field evidence has been found that rivers can make extensive flat surfaces in reality. We don't see modern rivers currently making such surfaces because the climatic and tectonic instability of the late Cenozoic has not allowed any mode of landscape shaping, be it lateral planation, downcutting, wasting, or any other process, to persist for very long. But the field evidence for this process actually occurring is quite convincing, as documented by Osborne and Dutoit, 1991. This lateral migration could explain why we don't see any infilled yet shallow channels on the unconformity surface as well, because the walls of any shallow river channels could simply be destroyed by the lateral erosion of the river as it migrates. There would be no permanent channels to infill. To summarize then, the Grand Canyon area during this period of erosion was close to sea level in a tectonically calm area, and the region was getting progressively more arid over time. This means the flatness of the contact is not really a surprise. Deep topography could not form due to the closeness to sea level, and even shallow topography would be severely limited due to wind being the primary erosive agent, rather than river incision. But even if we do assume river incision was a dominant process, it's possible for rivers to make a flat surface too. As an aside, wave erosion during a transgression can shave off erosional relief and leave a flat surface, but because the Coconino is a desert, this mechanism cannot be invoked. That would only apply if the layer overlying the unconformity was marine. As for the lack of any sort of basal soil horizon or rubble, this is not surprising either. An increasingly arid environment would not be very conducive towards the formation of soils, as Nelsted's blog explains, link in the description, and wind deflation would likely destroy what little developed. It is also generally accepted that the Hermit Shale was not lithified to any significant degree by the time the Coconino was deposited on top of it, as evidenced by cracks at the top of the Hermit Shale. Be they genuine infill desiccation cracks or cracks from sand injectites, both would require the Hermit Shale to be relatively unlithified even after the Coconino covered it. Even now, the Hermit Shale is very crumbly and any eroded chunks easily break down into very tiny pieces. In the past, with it being mostly unlithified and the surface becoming extensively dried out and crumbly, it would be expected that any chunks would also be very easily destroyed by the desert wind abrasion. This means that the uniformitarian scenario does not expect significant amounts of clasts to be eroded from the Hermit Shale and preserved in layers to form a basal conglomerate. Young Earth creationists may still ask for evidence of erosion, but that evidence comes from the fact that there is an entire formation, the Schnebly Hill Formation, between the Hermit and Coconino outside of the Grand Canyon region. Its absence confirms erosion occurred, or at the very least, deposition stopped in the area. Geologist Stephen Moshier explained it to me quite succinctly a few months ago. Quote, correlations to the Schnebly Hill outside of the Grand Canyon are important for coming up with some kind of estimate for the Hermit-Coconino hiatus in the Grand Canyon section. It is probably on the order of millions of years, perhaps as much as 5 to 7, end quote. So I want to thank the good corporal for his help in making this a much more thoroughly researched response than it would have been otherwise. But he also wanted me to remind all of you to please check his sources. None of this is original to him. It was found in various papers and in consultation with professional geologists.
And we would expect to see a soil zone underneath that top layer, but it's not there.
Why would we expect this? The Hermit Shale is marine and the Coconino Sandstone is a sandy desert. Neither environment is well known for extensive soil formation, so we really shouldn't expect to see a paleosol there.
This makes more sense if the layers formed quickly than over millions of years.
Tell you what, you figure out how to get a single flood to make two separate kinds of rock in sequence in the same place, neither of which can be formed by a flood, and one of which can't be formed by water, and I'll start taking the unconformity between the Hermit Shale and the Coconino Sandstone at the Grand Canyon seriously as evidence for Noah's flood.
So why do they want a time gap between those layers? Evolutionists need millions of years for evolution to occur, so they've got to put those years somewhere.
No one needs a time gap. It just so happens that there is one, and this is further evidenced, as I said before, by the fact that in places north of the Grand Canyon, the gap isn't there, and instead there is the Schnebly Hill Formation between the two. So the time gap is the time it took for the formation to be deposited. This time gap isn't made up. It's well evidenced both in and out of the canyon, and its absence wouldn't do anything to discredit mainstream geology or evolution. After this, for a while there's a commercial telling you how to get a CMI speaker to your church, and then they go on complaining about cartoon arcs and pointing at the actual biblical proportions of the ark. I have no real dog in the fight over the dimensions of the ark, and I'm perfectly happy to accept CMI's measurements, so I cut that bit out.
Of course, skeptics will still say there's no way Noah could have fit 2 of each of millions of species on the ark.
That's true, he couldn't have.
That's true.
But let's talk about kinds, shall we?
Yeah, but Noah didn't need to take 2 of every species alive today. Genesis 6 verse 20 says, of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind, 2 of every sort shall come to you to keep them alive. Now the word kind here refers to a much larger group than species. For example, the canine kind would include dogs and wolves and coyotes, etc., variations that arose after the flood by way of both natural and artificial selection.
But does it include the African painted dog, the Indian dhole, the maned wolf, the extinct direwolf, the non-canine but still closely related borophagians or bone-crushing dogs? How do you know that the kind is caninae and not, say, canidae, which would include the previously mentioned borophagians, but also the more distantly related, weasel-like Hesperocyaninae? Or why not the narrower genus Canis, and the genus Vulpes being separate kinds? See, there is no actual objective place where you can draw the line between kinds. CMI, like answers in Genesis, just draws a line somewhere around the families because that gets them a number of animals that they find reasonable. This is starting with a conclusion and creating a post hoc explanation to fit it. This is the exact opposite of how science is supposed to work.
Also in Genesis 7:22 we read, "Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died." Now this doesn't include insects because they breathe through the tiny pores in their skeletons, not nostrils.
Yeah.
And they could have survived on floating mats of ripped up, tangled vegetation.
Interesting. But let's read the verse right before Genesis 7:22. That is, verse 21. It says in the New International Version,
"Every living thing that moved on the land perished. Livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind."
Leviticus 11:29 and 30 include the snail as a swarming creature, and verse 41 in the same chapter includes anything that creeps on the earth with more than 4 legs as a swarming thing. Gee, it's almost like quote mining by creationists doesn't stop with science. They'll quote mine the Bible too. So according to the Bible, animals like terrestrial arthropods and mollusks also died unless they were on the ark. So Noah had to have room for ants, bees, cockroaches, silverfish, scorpions, slugs, snails, coconut crabs, mosquitoes, tsetse flies, bloat flies, etc. on the ark. You'd think he could have left the last 3 off, but evidently he did not. I wonder which animals on the ark got to be the lucky host to parasitic bloatfly larvae and live in excruciating pain as the grubs gnawed through their living tissue, forming a blister. It's not often that humans drive an animal to extinction and that I approve of it, but the North American bloatflies were wiped out primarily by ranchers, and I couldn't be happier about it.
Yeah, no fish either. Now, many did get buried, but clearly some survived.
I mean, they wouldn't have really, as you're mixing together salt and fresh water. And for all the sediment to be laid down in this event, you're also going to stuff the gills of most fish full of dirt, meaning they won't be able to breathe. Further, any bottom-dwelling fish would certainly go extinct, as all of them would be buried by this. But hey, let them have this one. The Bible doesn't say they died, so sure, they didn't.
Ark researcher John Wood-Morripy estimates that there were about 8,000 created kinds on the Ark, so 16,000 individual animals, plus a few more of the ceremonially clean animals.
So Wood-Morripy is the source for both CMI and AIG in their claims about the 8,000 animal kinds on the Ark. And remember, that's excluding all the non-vertebrates that the Bible explicitly requires to be on the Ark. So, since I have more information about exactly what kinds there were from AIG, I'm going to use their ideas as a proxy for broader young Earth creationism. If CMI doesn't like it, they can explain to me their stance on kinds right after they explain how the coconino managed to form in open air under a flood, and what evidence they have that Ken Ham's secretary was a demon-possessed necrophiliac. Anyway, apparently all of Proboscidea, that is elephants and their ancestors and relatives, are one kind. This is because otherwise, you'd need a lot of really big elephant-type animals on the Ark, especially since creationist estimates of Proboscidean diversity is over 500 species. Now, if we assume the impossibly rapid speciation rate of 1 new species per generation of Proboscidean, that means that at least every generation, a couple Proboscideans happen to both give birth to opposite-sex members of the same new species. We get to just enough time to reach full Proboscidean diversity by today. But we don't have that long. We have only a couple hundred years because we need mammoths by the Ice Age, and they are among the most derived Proboscideans, which means if you have mammoths, then all but like 1 speciation event has to be accounted for before that. That means that you're going to need more like 4 species per generation. The other option is to just say that there were more kinds of Proboscideans, but then you end up with dozens of giant animals on the Ark. Ah, you might say, but what about bringing babies? Well, elephants are weaned at about 5 years, so bringing babies would require Noah and family to care for several zoos worth of baby, gigantic animals. In fact, they start out at about 1.5 imperial tons, or 750 kilograms. And don't forget that elephants eat 200 to 600 pounds of food per day, and you also have to feed all the sauropods and trichotheres and giant ornithopods, etc. Click the card above for a more in-depth dive into Proboscidean problems for creationism.
The overall volume of the Ark is over 500 railroad stock cars. Wood-Morripy calculated the average size of all the animals would have been about the size of a sheep. And even in cages, 16,000 sheep-sized animals would only take up about a third of the floor space. And newer calculations indicate an average size closer to the size of a rat, so even less space would be needed.
Okay, but you can't just assume that everybody is going to need an average amount of space, and there you go. There are outliers on the large size, and they are going to be the prohibitive ones. So let's assume 400 pounds of food on average for each Proboscidean, and since we now know that you need more than 2, let's go with the more reasonable, but still absurdly small number of 8. That's 3,200 pounds of food per day. Now let's be generous and say that elephant feed is about as dense on average as hay. It's actually often less dense, but who cares? That comes out to about 10.5 pounds per cubic foot. Now, Noah and the animals, apart from a few birds, were in the ark for 150 days, so that's 3,200 pounds of food times 150 days for 480,000 pounds of food, occupying 45,714 and a quarter cubic feet. Now, keep in mind that the water outside isn't safe to drink, since it's full of dead animals and it's brackish. So how much do elephants drink per day? Well, on average, it's 83.6 liters a day, but let's just say 80 to be generous and make the math easier. So that's 80 liters times 8 elephants times 150 days, for a total of 96,000 liters of fresh water that Noah has to bring on the ark and keep fresh. And that's just to water the elephants and their associated relatives. And remember that only 8 humans are caring for these animals, so each day, each person must deliver 10 liters of water and 150 pounds of food on average. So that's 172 pounds of resources brought to elephants per day per person on average, and the average amount of waste for an elephant is going to about equal the amount of food eaten. So we're looking at about 150 pounds of fecal matter each day per person. So each person will also have to remove 150 pounds of waste, assuming that somehow we can ignore urine. So that's 322 pounds of delivery and takeaway per person just for proboscideans. A typical human can safely carry about 15 pounds on their back, give or take. So let's assume that on average they have to travel about 225 feet in each trip to and from. And let's assume that on average they walk at a brisk 5 feet per second, which is faster than humans normally walk. So they're fast walking here. Each trip takes 45 seconds, but it will also take time to shovel up poop, pour water, and put feed in some kind of feeding trough. At least a couple minutes. So we're looking at a solid hour of work per day per proboscidean. And that's just them. That ignores all the other large animals like Tyrannosaurids, Carcharodontosaurids, Abelisaurids, Hyracodontid, the equids, the Rhinoceratoideans. And then we have all the families of sauropods, of which there are about 10 depending on how you count them. Let's assume that each of these animals has similar needs. And this is just to feed the animals. Never mind that they will all need exercise and cleaning at least some of the time. And you still have about 16,000 more animals, excluding the invertebrates, which means you will need 8 people to take care of about 147 animals per hour per day to account for every other mammal, reptile, amphibian, insect, arachnid, and so on. And that's being generous. That means that each person has to fully tend to at least 2.5 animals per minute, or 1 animal about every 25 seconds. And that's just because we accounted for a tiny fraction of the large animals on the ark. This all assumes that humans are working 15 hours a day non-stop for 150 days, never having a day off. And remember, I skipped realistic calculations for how long it would take for many animals, like bovids, camelids, cervids, hippopotamids, crocodiles, alligators, which aren't in the same family by the way, so presumably not the same kind, etc. The more large animals that have to be on the ark, that I could include, the less time anyone has for any other animal. The whole thing is just absurd on its face, and the only reason the authors could take the story as anything but absurd is that their idea of animal diversity was limited to basically just the ancient Near East.
Yeah, the food and water needed would take up only about 25% of the ark's volume. That leaves plenty of room for badminton court, go-kart track, swimming pool, actually for hundreds of people.
Yeah, food only takes up a bit of space when you assume low average sizes and absurdly low animal counts. But if you account individually for the large animals, you run into problems, as we've already seen. And additionally, no one has yet bothered to my knowledge to account for all the invertebrates that the Bible says were on the ark. Next up, they have another commercial break. But this is where I'm going to leave it for today. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe, unless of course you didn't like it, in which case hit the dislike button and let me know why you didn't like it down in the comments. If you do subscribe, make sure you hit the bell icon and turn on all notifications so that you're always notified when there's more Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above: Bob Knob, Bent Hovind, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Patrick Dennis. My patrons and channel members really help make this channel possible, and without them, this channel wouldn't exist. If you would like to support me, you can click the join link on this channel below this video, or you can click on my Patreon, link in the description, and pledge. On Patreon, there is an option for an annual subscription, which comes with a 10% discount. And joining the channel will give you access to my custom emojis. However, if a regular pledge isn't for you, I do have a merch store. And if monetarily helping out the channel isn't a thing you can do, every like, share, and comment really helps the channel.